Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking some time out of your schedule today for our What's New in Dynamics 365 Business Central 2021 Release Wave 1 webinar. My name is Tess, and I'm the facilitator today. Before I pass it over to our presenter, I want to remind you that if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the questions area in the control panel in the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded and shared with you after the event. So I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today, Will Haber, who is a solution specialist on our Dynamics 365 Business Central team here at Encore. So Will, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Tess. So today, what we're going to be going over mainly is the what's new and like the new features that I wanted to highlight in Dynamics 365 Business Central, the release wave 1 of this year. So there's a few different, before I get into it, there's a few different features that I really wanted to highlight, more on the financial side, to kind of get a better aspect and a better overlook into what the new features are that Microsoft is focusing on and how they can be applied to your environment. So let's get into it. So the first, the main 5 features that I wanted to go over today is the general ledger entries. There's an ability to correct dimensions now. 2, there's multiple bank reconciliation improvements that they've outlined. 3, the Streamlined bank file import, the statement file import, so you can now map your bank statement file import feature and functionality. You can also do the default dimension restrictions. The Microsoft has made that available for code mandatory features on dimensions for default. And I also wanted to highlight the payment reconciliation journal improvements that they made. Now, it's something that a lot of customers, we don't really see typically a lot of customers utilize that, but it is something that Microsoft is focusing on, so I just wanted to highlight that there. So now to get into the features. So basically, the general ledger entries dimension corrections. So I'm going to go into my Business Central demo environment and kind of show you how each one of these features works. So for example, if I have a sample transaction here in the general journal, but I'm going to go into Business Central and actually show you how it works. So this is my my version 18 sandbox environment, and I'm going to go over to the general journal. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and post a few transactions with specific dimensions. So right now we have in this general journal, we have a payment made to a vendor, for example. I'm going to add the vendor Fabricam, for example, in the demo environment. Payment of $300. I'll add an additional line for a different vendor. So we'll do worldwide importers. And we'll do a $250 payment. And so what we can do now is we can actually look at the dimensions right here. So essentially, this is basically where you can view the different dimension codes and how you can correct them. Well, this is the beginning of how you can enter the dimensions. So for example, in the department, I have 3 different dimensions. I'm going to do the admin dimension, and for a large company in the customer group. And I'm going to do a different dimension here, sales, and for a medium-sized company. So I'm going to go ahead and put a balancing account here as well, just so we can balance out the costs. Actually, I'm going to do this. And then I'm going to go preview the posting. So we have to add a balancing account here. So that's what I was adding before. So we'll add an accrued interest account for both of these. And within that, I'll add the dimensions over here. that we were going to specify here, so we can get some dimensions on our transaction. Okay, so now we have on the posting preview, we'll actually see that these dimensions will post through. So I'm going to go ahead and post these transactions in real time here. So they've been posted. So now when I filter to these dimensions in the general ledger entries, so the second step is once the transactions are posted, let's say I wanted to correct, for example, for one of the transactions, the sales for a medium-sized company. I wanted to create, do a sales admin for a large-sized company, for example. I didn't want to have the, I didn't want to have those dimensions tied to that second transaction. So what I can do is I can go to the general ledger entries. I'm going to go ahead and filter to those transactions. Filter posting date. And so the transactions that I wanted to filter to are right here. So I'm going to actually filter to the balancing account of 13,300. So that's the balancing account over here, right here, 13,300. So we have two transactions here. So the first thing to look at is when you want to do a dimension correction, you can look at the entry and you can look at correct dimensions. So what this will do is this will open up a page for dimension corrections, and it'll basically specify your ability to correct dimensions now in the updated version. So when I click this, it'll basically take me to this specific transaction. But if I wanted to do multiple transactions, for example, I can select all of these, go to entry, correct dimensions. So essentially what we have here is we have the two transactions in the selected ledger entries over here. And these two transactions essentially are going to be tied to these dimensions. So it gives you an idea of what the dimensions are on each transaction. And so it gives you a dimension change log here. You can enter a description for the dimension correction. So I'm going to do test corrections on this description. It also gives you a date and time when the change was modified, and also when it was created as well, and who modified and who created the dimension. So this is critical and important, obviously, for change control. And this will actually have a history table of dimension corrections and who corrected which dimensions, which user corrected which dimensions within the system. You can also update analysis views within this dimension corrections tool. And so at the end of the correction, it'll basically update the analysis views if you already have them created for a dimension correction. So if you have any analysis views tied to those dimensions. So what I'm going to do here is on the dimension value code of department, for example. So on the admin and sales right here. So we have two different dimensions. So like, let's say I wanted to only make sure these two transactions were under the administration department. What I can do is I can actually change this over here. So the new dimension value code will be administration. So that's a change. So right now it highlights this line and it says change to administration. So let's say I wanted to change this customer group, this dimension to the medium in businesses, for example. I can change the administration, and I can also change this to medium. So it pulls up a list of your dimensions associated with that specific dimension code, and you can change it to medium, for example. I can also leave these as no change too as well. So there's either change or no change, and then the change will be the dimension codes that you specify. The no change will basically leave the dimensions as is. So we have the selected ledger entries, we have the change of dimensions. So what I can do is I can do one of two things. I can first validate the dimension changes. And by validating the dimension changes, when I click that, it's going to basically run a job or a report that's going to validate all these dimension changes. and see if they're okay to actually correct within the system, if any errors will be caused. So this will be successfully scheduled. So essentially that's validating the dimension changes right now. So I go back to correct dimensions. And actually, let me go back to the history of dimension corrections over here. And so right now, currently this is the table where this would be historical transactions of historical dimension corrections. So right now I can actually add to this table. I can delete from this table, but I can't, it's basically a log of the dimension corrections, more or less. So within the dimension corrections, if I decide to actually correct the dimensions instead of validating the dimension corrections, what I can do is I can go back in dimension corrections. I can do the same dimensions, same description as well. I can do the business group. Well, actually, no, not the business group. The customer group and the department. So the customer group, what that'll be is that'll be medium in this case. So just to verify those dimensions. So we'll change that to medium. And then for the department, we'll actually change this to admin. We'll go ahead and change that to administration. So now we have these two dimension correction changes. So now what I can do is I can actually run this dimension correction. And when I click run, it's going to open up a window, and it'll basically open up the maximum amount of attempts to run, the earliest start date and time. So right now I'm going to select, because my system date is 1/12, I'm going to run it for 1:12 p.m. On April 13th. And so I'm going to run immediately. And so what that does is it immediately runs. If it has 3 attempts, more than 3 attempts, it'll actually, it won't run anymore at that point. But it's a maximum number of attempts to run at 3. And the duration, it can last up to 12 hours total for the report, but the report runs pretty quickly. Okay. So now we go back into the entries, and we go to history of dimension corrections. And so right now it's actually scheduled to run. So if I go to correct dimension, so this one was changed to medium. And so essentially what I can do is now it should populate the actual entries of the history of the dimension corrections once I ran it. Let me try that one more time, actually. Okay, so medium. Change this to large. Change this to admin. Okay. And then so essentially I will go ahead and, so there's a couple different things you can do here as well. You can add related entries as well, but I'll go ahead and actually run this for now. If I run this, actually, let me, okay. All right, so bear with me one moment here. I'm just going to go ahead and review the dimensional corrections. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and test the corrections again. I'm going to go ahead and validate these changes. So I'm going to go ahead and select these. Go ahead and correct the dimensions as well. Okay, so essentially this is what creates and generates an entry. I think the reason why, and the reason why it was actually not running before is because I didn't select the actual date time in the future that was running the job. Because I selected the current time, it wasn't actually running the report. So if I go ahead and I click edit here, so this actually changes the dimensions to large and admin. So this was completed. So essentially what I can do is I can either undo this dimension change if I want to, and I can actually look back on the actual the dimensions, and I can look at the dimensions themselves and see that there's admin and there's large as well. So they currently created the dimension correction. So the way you can do controls around this is that you can actually have historical changes of change logs of what the dimension corrections were, who created them, and it's an entry table essentially. So they have all the dimension changes. They have this modification. They have when it was created, when it was ran, and what the changes were on each dimension. So that's essentially the feature, the first feature I wanted to highlight and really go over. The second major feature that I want to go over, and this is the bigger portion of what the improvements were done by Microsoft, was the bank reconciliation functionality improvements. So in order to start with the bank reconciliation, I want to go to my bank account reconciliation. And so I have a couple different bank account reconciliations here, one for my checking and one for my savings. So right now, what I can do is, there's a couple different things that I want to highlight here. The checking account and the savings account. So if I go into the checking account for the bank statement, there's a few different things that I really want to highlight. So the bank account ledger entries, you have this standard bank account statement that you can actually view and look at the total balance, the statement, last statement balance, as well as the statement ending balance. You can also look at the bank statement lines, which are currently blank. And so one of the major features that Microsoft introduced was the ability to customize your bank statement import through a bank statement import wizard. And this bank statement import wizard will actually map your bank statement import so that when you click bank and import bank statement, it now has the ability to map to a CSV file or a flat file when you import your bank statement into the reconciliation. So what I mean by that is, if I go to the bank import export setup, and I go over to, I have a couple of them mapped already. So essentially, the ones that I had mapped was the test check bank import and these two bank imports over here. But if I go to Actions and I go to Bank Statement File Format Wizard, what this is essentially when I click on it, it's a wizard. It's like it's an assisted setup within the system, and you can actually download a bank statement file by like a sample one by standard. And so if I click this, it downloads for me a CSV file and what I need to map my transactions to look exactly like this when I'm testing my bank statement file import. So essentially, this is what the file would look like. So we would want to have a date. The sort and account number isn't as important for this file. The amount and the description are really what's very important as well. So the account name, the amount, and the date, because those are the three fields, and also the transaction details would be more important in that case because the transaction details are the description. So what I mean by that is when you're going through the assisted setup, there's three fields that you really want to look out for: the date, the amount, and the description, because those are the fields that you're going to map to when you're doing your import file. So if I go back into Business Central, I can go through the assisted setup. I'll click Next. You can upload a bank statement file. So I'm going to go ahead and upload one. And so I have this file. So I'm going to go ahead and upload that. So it's successfully uploaded. So now I can define the bank statement layout myself. And I click Next. So the header lines to skip. So what this means is the first part of the setup is that there's a header line. If there are headers on the data, you want to define this as one here. And basically what that means is there's one header row, and then there's all the data that contains underneath it. So in my case, there's one header row. So I'm going to go ahead and do one. Some files, they have just data involved within the bank statements and what the bank gives you. So we're going to go ahead and choose 0 in those cases. So there's no header lines to skip. So I go ahead and click Next. My column separator is going to be a comma in this case. So basically, that's the comma delimited file, the CSV file that we're referring to. And in my case, if I look back on my actual file that I'm importing, I got to look at how many columns there are in the file. So in this case, there are 4 columns as denoted by the file. So what I can do is go back into Business Central and I can define this as 4. I click Next. The date column, this is what I'm going to need my file open for. So the date column, as we can see, we can put them side by side. The date column right now is 1. The amount column is 4. And the description column is 3. So it's going to be 1, 4, 3. So we go ahead and click Next. These are the column numbers. Date format. Now this is where it gets interesting. So essentially, there's a couple different date formats here that I want to kind of bring to light and bring to note. So essentially, within the bank statement file imports, there's different formats that the dates can actually take and dates can actually have. In the most Canadian banks, where the bank statement file is going to be set up, it's going to be lowercase. In this case, the format will be 4 lowercase y's, a capital M, and a lowercase d. And so this is basically just defining the date format of what your transaction dates are. So in this case, it'll be dot. The European format would be comma in this case. So it's a little confusing in terms of how it is, how it's defined within the date format and the decimal separator. And so this is the key section that you really want to focus on and pay attention to, because this is where a lot of people or a lot of mappings can be misconstrued and can be definitely affected by the date format that you enter here. So I go ahead and click Next. So now I'm going to go ahead and test the bank statement file import. I'm going to go ahead and upload. test the import. So it's going to give me a preview of what the actual bank statement is going to look like. So right now it's successful because there's no red on any of the columns. So it'll successfully import. So I go ahead and close this. I click next. And now if I was to define a bank account that this was linked to, I can give it a custom name and I can link it to my existing bank account. So I'm going to go ahead and not do that just because I already have it linked to a bank account. But essentially, this is how you can set up your file mapping within your bank statement imports. And feel free to ask me questions after the webinar in terms of this, because this is a very critical, I think this is a very important feature that I wanted to highlight. So go ahead back into the bank account reconciliation. And so I already have this set up. I'm going to go ahead and go into the reconciliation. So in the reconciliation, I'm going to go to bank, import bank statement. And so I'm going to select the file to import. So my current file that I have that I want to import. And so based on the mappings, it's actually going to import that file that we just previously looked at. And so it imports into the bank statement line. And so this is how you can set up the mapping behind the bank statement import in a more streamlined way, instead of having a data exchange definition where you have to manually go into the data exchange and update that. This is kind of an assisted setup for that. So there's a couple different features that I wanted to highlight as well on the bank account reconciliations. There's one main feature in general on the bank account statements, the ability to undo a statement that I think is very powerful if you post the bank account reconciliation that is incorrect for whatever reason. So if I go ahead and go to a statement here, and so now you see on the top, I have the ability to undo. I have an undo button now available. And this undo button, what it's going to do is it's going to actually reverse the bank account and create a new reconciliation with the same information that I had before posting. And that bank statement that is right here, this would be deleted. So if I go ahead and go undo, and I click yes, this will be removed from this list, and it'll bring me to the bank account reconciliation of the statement number, 29 in this case. So this is the reconciliation that was removed, or that was undone. In this case, you have that ability to look at the bank account reconciliation, and you can undo a bank statement to get to a bank account reconciliation that you want to repost, essentially. So now I go ahead and I go back to bank account reconciliation. So let's go ahead and go back to that page. And there's a few more features that I really wanted to highlight over there. So there's a feature called, or the feature to change the statement number. So in this case, when this would be useful is, let's say you have a statement number that's out of sync or that's out of order, or you, for whatever reason, you want to change the statement number on a bank account reconciliation. Microsoft now gives you the ability to do so. So if I go ahead and action and go to change statement number, I can change this. For example, it pre-populates with the current statement number, and I can select a new statement number. Let's say is 31 in this case. So I click OK, and it automatically updates that statement number that I was on to 31. And this is a pretty powerful feature as well. They've really worked on the bank reconciliation and the file import improvements Microsoft has within the past update. So the next feature that I really want to highlight is related to default dimensions. And so within default dimensions, if I go back to the customer, for example, and I pick a customer here, let's say customer number 10,000 when it populates. And I go back to the dimensions. So I go to related customer dimensions and the dimensions over here. So what this is now, this feature is for the area dimension, for example, I have the dimension value code as 70. If it's set to code mandatory, what Microsoft has allowed you to do is it allows you to enter the allowed dimensions or the range of dimensions that you can allow on a transaction. So for example, this is set to 70 as a default, and this is from America, like North America and South America. But if I was to have a European dimension, what this system would do essentially is, like, let's say I wanted to have a Europe North, for example. So if I go ahead and go 30 here, it's going to throw an error essentially. And so what this error is it's saying that this dimension area is not allowed for this customer because of the allowed dimension allowed values in the filter. And that's very key and critical for posting transactions, for also setting default dimensions. So for example, if I change this back to 70 here, this is now this is within the range of allowed values. So if I go ahead and I go to a sales order or a sales invoice associated with this customer, and I try to post a transaction that's outside of that range of allowed values, it'll throw an error as well upon posting. And so that's the critical part of this this feature. And this is something that I would definitely encourage you to explore further. So for example, if I add this and just set up an invoice, if I go to related invoice dimensions over here, and I change this to 30, for example, it won't throw an error on the actual, you can still change the dimension, Microsoft allows you to, but when I go ahead and I preview the posting over here, I'll update the lines as well, and I go to preview posting, it'll actually throw the error upon preview. So this is the error, and this is where it's associated with the allowed values filter. And so that was the filter over there. It gives you a link as well to go to support and see what the actual dimensions, like that's the error, essentially dimensions used in the invoice are invalid. And it gives you a link to go ahead and edit that as well. So that's the fourth change that I wanted to highlight here. The last change that I really wanted to go over is the payment reconciliation journal. And so if you utilize this feature, they now give you the ability to apply entries in the payment reconciliation journal to employee ledger entries. So if you're using employees, if you have any ledger entries that are associated that you want to apply payment to for your bank, it now gives you the ability to do so. So in this case, there's the process, or if I do manual application or if I do apply automatically as well, I have the ability to apply these entries from the bank to employee ledger entries. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and go to my ledger entries over here. And so essentially there's I had a payment of a refund, let's say for $100,000 to this employee, Jim Olive. And if I go to the account name, it'll pull up the employee list. So it's basically pulling up the employee ledger entries associated with Jim Olive. So this is the employee card of Jim Olive in this case. And this is pretty powerful because if you're utilizing employees and you want to apply payments against those employees using the payment reconciliation journal, you now have the ability to do so. So those are the main features that I kind of wanted to go over. There's probably a few questions in terms of how those features impact the system functionality. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Tess. And thank you guys.
Thanks, Will. So yes, if anyone has any questions, please submit them into the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we have about 10 minutes to go over them. One question that's come in, Will, is, are all of these features available now, or are they available between now and October? How do we access them?
Great question. So they're available when essentially when your environment updates to version 18. And I think that that's the latest update of the release wave 1. So once your environment is updated, either it's going to be updated automatically through the new rollout, and it should be available, I would say, by end of the month. So be on the lookout for those changes.
That's great, thank you.
And
No other... Oh.
I was going to add, we do have a blog post as well as an accompanying video on our site that talks about how to manage your updates. So if you want to try and get that update sooner, that version 18 with these new features, definitely if you take yourself there to our blog on tenant administration, you can actually try and pick the day that you'd like this update to be applied, and you can apply it to your sandboxes before it goes to your production as well. So like I said, there's a blog post in our on our website that kind of walks you through that tenant management piece to help get these features potentially sooner.
That's great, thanks, Tony. So no other questions have come in. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the release wave 1, Will, before we close off today?
Yeah, so there's a link that I wanted to share. And it's essentially over here on this page. And so this basically will give you more information into what the application improvements are from that new release. So for example, you have different application environments or just different application improvements. So for example, assisted setup. There's a lot of different changes that are actually available to you within the new release updates and the new release versions. So definitely I would definitely encourage you to explore the Microsoft documentation associated with these different changes. Yeah, that's about it. That's what I had.
That's great, thank you. So before we go, if you could go back to your slides, just have a few things to cover before we wrap up today. So we have some upcoming webinars that, well, those look like some older webinars, but that's okay. On our events page that I'll put the link in the chat pane where you can see our events going into May. And then if you go to the next slide, there, Will, thank you. And I'll just put a link for our subscription preferences where you can opt in to receive emails about our events and our monthly newsletter, training opportunities, and product and service enhancements, and as well as a link for our Encore Care support and just some more information about Encore Care Unlimited. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Will, for sharing those 5 new features, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.